So for the second part where we're going to be doing a drawing, before you do the drawing, you want to set it up first in a good image. And you'll notice I have a lamp, and a lamp on a swivel base works best, but if you don't have one that can swivel, that's fine too. You can turn the object around instead. And what we want to do is we want to set up the lamp, and we want to set up in the object in a way where we can see its form, and also in a way, as you'll see in a moment, so that when the light hits it, you can see the form much more easily because of the shadows. Now right now you'll see the light is right on top of it, and that's not a good spot, because what ends up happening is you don't see a whole lot of shadow. You just kind of see the general shape of it, but you don't see how it's three-dimensional very easily. You just see a little bit of shadow at the bottom there. Now you'll see in a moment that I'm going to turn the light around, and you see as I turn, you'll see much more shadow, and all of a sudden it starts to look much more three-dimensional. There we go, see? And you can kind of see, although it's getting darker, you can see how it looks 3D, whereas before it looked almost flat. So you don't want the light right above. You probably want it on the side somewhere. And again, if you can't turn your light around like mine, you can turn the object around, as you'll see in a moment, right? Now what's nice about this view is you can kind of see the way the object kind of turns because the light changes as it goes around it. And I'm going to move the light around again, and you can kind of see it's changing again. So here's another view of it. And this is from a different angle now. That's coming from the front instead. And again, you can see those deep shadows, and that's what makes it look three-dimensional, especially as it casts shadows along the table. Right? Now I'm going to skip ahead to the white version because that's the one I ended up using. So let me just skip ahead. So we're going to move to the second part of our assignment. And now that we've made a we've wrapped in object, and we can see its form a little bit better, we need to choose a photo that really shows off its form, because we're going to be sketching that form and trying to draw some of its shadows and highlights, the dark parts and the light parts. Just going to review some of our photos and see which one works best. So as we were saying earlier, with the dark gray or the gray plastic bag, doesn't work quite so well because you can't see the light parts. It all looks very dark. And you'll find as well that some of the green trim, or whatever that's called, doesn't look quite so good. This one's not too bad. It's kind of bright enough. This one's a little bit better. But you see that when we switch to the white, you can see the shadows much more clearly. So if you have a white garbage bag, or if you have a white plastic bag, even if it has a print on it, that would work out much better. So I'm just going to go through these and see which ones work a little bit better. I think that one's okay because you get that nice part underneath there. You can see it's raised as opposed to this part, and you can see some of the form of the hairdryer. This part's a little bit dark. It's hard to see the overall form of it. It just looks like, oh, I really like this one. This one's not bad either. You can see that large part here. You can see that raised part here as well, the thinner part, and you can see the shadow here. This one's really dark. It's not bad because it shows the form, but for those of you that are uncomfortable with shadow, you might want to avoid something that has too much shade. So I think we'll do something maybe in the middle. That's not too hard, not too easy, but still shows the form. I would either go for this one or this one. I think I'm going to go for this one because it looks like it's a bit easier to draw. Okay. Now, as far as materials go, I know that we don't all have materials available. So use whatever you have available. I kind of just dug around what I have right now, and I happen to have markers and pencil, crayons, and pen. The only thing I would recommend is don't use markers. You want to use something that's more of a fine point. So fine point meaning sharp, so either a pen or a finely sharpened pencil. And I wouldn't use one of those mechanical pencils or a drafting pencil like I happen to have, where the point is too sharp. Those are great for things like math, but they're not great for things like sketching. So I'm gonna use something that most people have at home, even if it's not theirs. I'm just gonna use a pen, just to kind of show you that you can do this even with a pen. All right. Now, the thing that I need you to do first is I need you to look at the shape of what it is we're drawing. So you're going to see there's a thin part here, and then there's a kind of a bulge, and then there's a kind of a longer, it's almost looks like an ice cream cone actually. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by just drawing that shape, and I'm just going to pause this so I can show you. So I'm just going to show you with a pen tool that I have on here. Let's change this to red. So what I was talking about here was you've kind of got this big ice cream like, oops, let's undo that. This big ice cream like blob shape here. So it's kind of like a rounded off triangle. And then you've got this other part here. So it looks almost like a hammer actually. And then finally, I'm just going to outline what the shadow looks like. So the majority of the shadow is this part here. And then you've got an even kind of lighter shadow over here. Okay, so we're not going to worry about all those other details for now. We're going to start first by just trying to sketch out some of those major shapes. Okay, and don't worry about all the little details like all the little folds and ripples. I'm not worried about that. We just want the overall form. Okay, so just adjust my camera a little bit. It's a little bit crooked. There we go. Oops, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to start by drawing that large overall form. Oops. And I would suggest you draw a little bit bigger because you'll find it's a little bit easier to shade later on. Whoops. Well, there we go. Something kind of like that. So mine's not perfect, but it's close. And then we're going to draw. So you'll notice this is about roughly, it's about half the size, maybe a bit more. Of this, so half the size would be about that much, so I think we're about the right length, and it's gonna look something like that. And you'll notice the bottom part's a little bit bigger here. There's more of a lump because of the extension cord, and then what I do is I'm going to sketch in the shadow. So very important that you get this part over here. Right, this part here that has the highlight, so I'm going to make sure I include that. And then I'm just going to sort of just rough in the shadow. Whoops. And then there's the other part of the shadow over here, like that. And I'm just going to also include this part here, which is that cord here, like that. It's a bit easier to see. Okay. So that's a good start. Oh, and by the way, as far as paper goes, for those of you that say you don't have paper, I just use some goose paper, actually, some scrap paper, so that's perfectly fine. Whatever you have will work. We're not too picky here. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start drawing. Alright, so now I'm going to start to add some of the details in that I see. So some of these shapes here. So that shape is kind of like the shape of the end of the hair dryer, and I'm not going to draw on every little thing that I see, but for the most part that's the kind of major form, and these are kind of some of the bigger shapes and bigger shadows. Oops. And then at this point what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start to do some shading. So I think I've got, for the most part, I'm just going to maybe make this not quite so rounded, because you'll see that this bottom part isn't so rounded here. Let me just zoom in a bit here if I can. Let's see. Do I have a zoom tool? Oh, there we go. There we go. It's a bit blurry, the photograph, but you can kind of see it's not quite so rounded, so it's more of a bumpy kind of texture. I'm just gonna add a little bit more of a bumpy kind of texture. And then this part is more like this, and there's some veins there like that, and we'll add those later on. And then this part is kind of more like that. There we go. And then there's this kind of line that comes across. And here you'll see it kind of folds up like this. So I'm talking about this part right here. Kind of folds up like that. And then like that again. And this part here, it's a little bit hard to see, but it's not perfectly smooth like I got it. So it's kind of more like this actually. It's kind of like bulges of it. Like that. There we go. Okay, now the shadow, you'll notice there's little bits that come out. And there's a darker shadow here. So I'm going to make that a little bit darker. And there's another third shadow right here. And then that comes all the way across like this. So I'm talking about this part right here. So this shape looks something, whoops, like that. Mine's not perfect, but you kind of get the idea. And there's this kind of lighter shadow here. And then there's this big gap over here that's like this kind of rounded part like that. Now I know it looks a little bit strange right now. I'm just going to zoom out. So and now what I'm going to do is once you've kind of got the overall lines, I'm going to go in and I'm going to start blocking out some of the shadow. So the shadow is probably the easiest part to do. So let's start with that. Right. So you've got the darkest part and it kind of gradually gets lighter. So I'm just going to start by shading in kind of dark. Now if you want a cross hatch, which means go across like this, that would work too. And that way you can darken it some more. So with some cross hatching, I'm just going to do a bit more shadow. And then you'll notice as it gets closer to this edge, it kind of lightens up. So just ease off on the shading. Now I know it looks a little bit messy right now, but it'll make a little bit more sense as we go on. Okay, so just gonna shade it like this. And there we go. So it's kind of getting lighter and lighter as we go closer and closer. And you see I'm pressing lighter and lighter as well. Okay. Now this next part here, it's got a shadow as well, but it's not as dark. So I'm gonna do the same thing, but I'm gonna make the lines further apart, and I'm not gonna press quite so hard. So what I end up getting is thinner lines for the shadow. There we go. And you'll notice that this part gets a little bit darker, so I'm just gonna do a little bit of cross hatching here, just to make this part just a little bit darker. Now unfortunately, because with pen, it's not like pencil where you can kind of press down harder. If you happen to have sketching pencils, feel free to use those. I know not everybody has those, so that's why I'm not doing a demonstration with those. But if you happen to have sketching pencils, that's fine. There we go. Okay. Now when you hand this in, don't worry, because if your drawing looks a bit weird, you're gonna send the photograph as well so that I can kind of compare the two. Right. The next part I'm gonna do is the shadow for the cord. So you're gonna notice I'm simply going to do a really dark part there, like that. And you'll notice that my shading is actually a little bit more like scribbly actually. And that's perfectly fine because I'm not going for like a precise size drawing. I'm just trying to get a feel for what the object looks like and what the form is kind of like. Right, so if yours is kind of messy, you'll notice I'm almost kind of scribbling actually. That's perfectly fine as long as you can get it to look sort of like it. And if you want to kind of just make the edge not quite so harsh, you can kind of just shade like that. There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now we're going to move to the harder part, which is the actual hair dryer. I know some of you probably thought that was hard enough as it was. So I'm just gonna pause and let some of you do that right now. Now before I forget, I forgot one more thing. There is a little bit of a shadow out here as well. And it's lighter than this shadow again. So we have dark, medium, and then light. So I'm gonna do that now before I forget, because I have a feeling I'm gonna forget. So I'm just gonna space my shadow further apart, so I have more white of the paper showing through, and that'll make the shadow look a little bit lighter. Because again, unfortunately, I can't really vary the pressure of my drawing. Oh, sorry, of my pen. That won't make a difference. There we go. Okay. Just like that. All right. Okay, and there's a couple parts here that are like this. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna work on this part here. And you'll notice that for the most part, there's a dark vein that runs through it. So I'm gonna start with the darkest lines that run through. And you'll notice as well the edge here is very dark. So to make that edge look like it really stands out, I'm gonna start with a nice dark edge. And then I'm gonna make the second edge over here. So I'm doing the darkest parts. And then there's this really kind of dark ridge right over here too. So I'm gonna make that part. So I'm not gonna try to draw every little vein that's created. I'm just gonna create the major shapes. So then I'm gonna do the shadow here. So we're looking for large areas of shadow. That's this. And then the rest will be a little bit lighter. So you see these parts a little bit lighter here. And then we're gonna do this part here. And then this part here is probably a little bit darker, or sorry, a little bit lighter than that. Oops, my pen is falling apart. There we go. So then this part's gonna look something just kind of like that. There we go. So what ends up happening is you see that this back part ends up looking darker, and the reason for that is the sun, or my light, is actually coming from here. So that means this part's going to be the brightest, as you see, because it's facing it, and the part that's behind it and facing away from it, that's this part, has to be the darkest, and that part will also cast the shadow as well. Okay, so that's why these parts need to look as dark as they look. Okay, now the last part I'm gonna do, I know there's other parts here, I'm not gonna worry about all that. Maybe just add a little bit in here, just a touch. Now the last part I want to do is the handle, and the handle is fairly important because there's this kind of bright part here, and you need to see the handle being darker so that you can see that it's raised. So you'll notice that I'm just going to darken this part here a bit more. There we go. So this part needs to be fairly dark, so you understand that that's where the form of the handle ends, and this is the kind of shadow it creates. So there's a lot going on here. I'm not going to draw everything, but you'll notice most of the lines kind of wrap around it this way. Let me just zoom in a bit maybe. There we go. So you'll notice most of it kind of zooms or turns around it. So you'll see that when I sketch and when I shade, I'm also going to go like that too. And again, my shading is actually pretty scribbly and messy. So don't worry if yours is, but what you're just looking for is the major areas of shade, and you're just trying to recreate some of that in line and in the shape of your shaded areas. Now the edge has to be quite dark, so you'll notice I will go back a little bit darker, like that. And then finally we're just going to finish it off with Maybe add a little bit more here, just so it looks like it's not totally flat. And then I'm just going to finish off with the chord. So the chord here is like this, and it's just kind of big blob that kind of sticks out, kind of like that. Okay. Whoops. Whoopsie. Zoom out. There we go. So that's not too bad, I think. I mean, you kind of capture the form. You got this big blob here. And maybe to make this part stand out a bit more, I think this part needs to be a little bit darker than that. So I'm going to go back and just make it a little bit darker by adding a bit more cross-hatching. Because the problem is it was blending too much into the shadow. The shadow and the hairdryer looked a little bit too much like the same tone. And so it kind of blended into each other. So I think we need a little bit more here. There we go. So now it doesn't look like it's part of it. And you'll notice that at the edge it gets a little bit darker again. So I'm just going to add a little bit more at the edge. And that way that edge will kind of stand out a bit more again. So even if your drawing is a little bit messy, so long as you can see the form, that's the kind of important part, right? If you can kind of capture the lights and the dark shapes, then you should be able to kind of suggest the form. Right, now even if your shape is a little bit off, like let's say this ended up longer, or this ended up way bigger than it should have been, doesn't matter to me. I'm actually just interested in whether or not you can kind of capture the overall form of it, meaning it's kind of the way it's kind of three-dimensional. Okay, all right. I don't think that's too bad actually for a first attempt. And you might find that you might want to start over actually. You might not. You might find that you actually don't like the way it turns out. And so that's totally fine if you want to give it a second try. For those of you that really are stressed out about this, because I'm sure this is hard for some of you, I'm even okay if you print the picture out and you trace the outline on a window, like it's a light table. I'm okay with that too, because I don't want you to stress out about this, because I'm not there to show you, unfortunately. So, you know, give it a try. Trace out the shape if you have to, and then just try to get the shapes of the dark parts and the shapes of the light parts, and that would be great. Okay? And to be quite honest with you, I think the shape of mine's actually a little bit off. Now that I look at it more clearly again, I think mine's actually a little bit bigger than it actually should be. I'm just going to correct it a little bit more. Yeah, I think that's okay. Alright, so give it a try. And yeah, you can watch the video again if you need some pointers on how to do that.